Amid the brutal cold of northern Europe, there is one image that surprises many people when they arrive in Norway: the women. Tall, strong, with blonde hair blowing through the icy wind, walking calmly across the snow-covered streets. In Norway, women are not only symbols of mysterious Nordic beauty, but also of independence and equality. But few people realize that behind this dreamlike country, Norway was once one of the poorest nations in Europe. Just over a century ago, people here survived through endless winters in isolated villages surrounded by cliffs and freezing seas. Life was so harsh that many families could barely survive without the labor of women. And yet, from this frozen and impoverished land, Norway rose to become one of the richest, happiest, and most equal countries on Earth. So what created this miracle? How did a nation once trapped in poverty build such an unbelievably prosperous society? And why have so many other resource-rich countries failed to become another Norway? The story began long before oil was discovered beneath the North Sea. In the late 18th century, economist Thomas Malthus visited Norway. Behind its breathtaking landscapes was a brutal reality. At the time, Norway was still under Danish rule. Most people survived on tiny farms and limited fishing along the icy coast. Winters lasted nearly half the year. While mountains and harsh terrain kept towns isolated from one another, the glorious Viking Age had long faded into memory. Norway was not just poor, it was one of the harshest places in Europe. A few decades later, war, blockades, and famine pushed the country even deeper into crisis. Many believed Norway would remain a forgotten nation forever. But today, excluding tiny microstates, Norway ranks among the richest countries in the world, one of the happiest, one of the most democratic. Nearly every measure of prosperity places Norway near the top globally. So where does the real secret lie? Many countries tried to copy Norway's model, yet failed completely. What made Norway different? And could this system truly work anywhere else? Let's explore the mystery. The familiar curse. Outside of Norway, countries holding most of the world's oil reserves contribute less than 8% of global GDP. Venezuela, despite owning some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, became the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And it's far from the only example. Many oil-rich nations struggle with corruption, inequality, dictatorship, or economic collapse. Economists call this phenomenon the resource curse, or more specifically, the oil curse. Today, oil and natural gas still provide around 27% of the world's energy. Despite the rise of renewable energy, oil remains critically important. With prices often soaring, massive oil reserves should have guaranteed prosperity. But reality turned out to be far more complicated. In many ways, oil is like winning the lottery overnight. It brings enormous wealth, but also dangerous risks. Countries dependent on oil often use sudden revenue to cut taxes, expand subsidies, and increase government spending. Over time, the oil industry begins to dominate the entire economy while other sectors slowly weaken. Oil exports drive up the national currency. Citizens gain stronger purchasing power, but domestic industries become more expensive and less competitive globally. Meanwhile, politicians promise short-term benefits to gain public support. Dictators use oil money to strengthen their control, both focus on immediate power instead of long-term stability. And that is often the moment when countries fall into the most dangerous trap of wealth. Corruption spreads. National wealth becomes concentrated among a small elite. And eventually, the economy appears rich only on paper, while millions remain trapped in poverty. And yet, there seemed to be one extraordinary exception: Norway. What allowed Norway to avoid the fate of Venezuela, Libya, and so many other oil-rich nations? The answer began long before oil was ever discovered. About a century after Thomas Malthus visited Norway, the country gained independence from Sweden. But Norway was still poor, underdeveloped, and heavily dependent on exports like timber, fish, and raw minerals. Yet beneath that poverty, Norway was quietly building foundations that would later change everything. During the decades before independence, Norway took advantage of global free trade and developed the world's fourth-largest merchant fleet. This brought foreign income, while also giving Norwegians valuable experience in shipping, trade, and maritime technology. More importantly, the struggle for independence created a unique democratic system. Political power became widely distributed, workers gained influence, voting rights expanded, and major social reforms followed. That balanced political structure later became an invisible shield against corruption and authoritarian control. Ironically, the same harsh geography that kept Norway poor for centuries eventually became a major advantage. Its steep rivers and massive mountain systems allowed Norway to generate cheap hydroelectric power, laying the foundation for industrialization. But there was a problem. Nearly 75% of the country's hydropower production was controlled by foreign companies. The Norwegian government quickly saw the danger. They believed national resources should serve the Norwegian people, so laws were introduced to limit foreign ownership of hydropower resources, while preventing monopolies from dominating the economy. It sounded simple, but that early experience with resource control later became one of the key reasons Norway managed oil better than most nations. At the same time, railways, shipping, and modern transportation transformed Norway's position in Europe. A country once isolated by mountains and ice was now becoming deeply connected to the world. The economy expanded rapidly, industrialization accelerated, but what truly made Norway different was not its growth itself. It was how the country used that growth. While many nations focused on enriching elites, Norway invested heavily in education, public infrastructure, and social welfare. These policies seemed less exciting in the short term, but they created an incredibly stable foundation for the future. Still, Norway remained a small nation deeply tied to global trade. That meant it could not escape the geopolitical shocks of the 20th century. Norway stayed neutral during both world wars, yet its merchant fleet suffered enormous losses during World War I. Then on April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Norway. The country remained occupied for 5 years. After the war, like much of Europe, Norway had to rebuild almost from scratch. It joined international institutions and became one of the largest per capita recipients of Marshall Plan aid. But the most important changes came afterward. Following World War II, Norway's Labour Party built a unique social democratic system. The state played a major role in the economy, while private businesses were still allowed to compete and grow. It was not fully capitalist, but it was not a Soviet-style planned economy either. From 1945 to 1975, Norway's GDP grew by around 3.3% annually, remaining remarkably stable for 3 decades. Although taxes were among the highest in the world, the government used that money to invest heavily in education and workforce training. As a result, Norway developed one of the most highly skilled populations on Earth. At the same time, social welfare expanded dramatically, income inequality narrowed, inflation stayed low, and unemployment remained minimal. And then, just as Norway had finished building the foundations of a modern nation, they discovered something that would change their destiny forever: oil. By this point, Norway's economy was already growing steadily, but it was still far from becoming the global powerhouse we know today. Then a discovery beneath the sea changed everything. But before continuing, Kamfar Channel would like to sincerely thank all of you who have supported us throughout this journey, especially those who trusted and used the Sach Tingon app. Your support helped us create a platform that makes knowledge easier to access through concise summaries of more than 2,000 famous books from around the world. We hope it becomes a valuable companion in your work, studies, and daily life. And now, back to the story, the Black Gold Treasure. By the 1960s, Norway had caught up with much of Europe. It was no longer poor, but it was not yet one of the richest nations either. Then everything changed forever. The discovery of massive natural gas reserves in the Netherlands sparked speculation that oil might also exist beneath the North Sea. One critical question immediately emerged. If oil truly existed, who would own it? After intense debate, Norway claimed sovereignty over its waters. Even without certainty about the actual reserves, the government divided exploration zones and granted licenses to international companies. One of them was Phillips Petroleum. At first, drilling attempts repeatedly failed. No oil was found. Many believed the North Sea was simply an expensive gamble. But then, because of a technical clause in the contract, the company was forced to conduct one final drill at a greater depth. That moment changed Norwegian history forever. In 1969, the first oil from the North Sea was successfully discovered. This was not just another oil field. It was one of the largest offshore oil discoveries ever made in Europe. A treasure of black gold hidden beneath freezing waters. The news quickly triggered a global oil rush. Within less than a decade, Norway's oil production per capita surpassed nearly every other nation, transforming the country into one of the world's leading oil powers. The oil industry exploded. Thousands of high-paying jobs appeared. Quiet coastal villages gradually became busy industrial centers. Billions of dollars poured into the economy, completely reshaping the country. But here's the important part. Norway's story was not unique. Many other countries experienced similar moments of sudden wealth, so why did most of them eventually fail? Escaping the curse. In the early years, Norway's oil development looked very similar to other oil-producing nations, but the biggest difference was how they managed their resources. Unlike Venezuela, where foreign companies controlled most oil operations and kept much of the profits, Norway chose a very different path. Its political system did not concentrate power in one ruler or small elite group. Power was widely distributed, with strong systems of oversight and balance. That difference was critical. In many resource-rich nations, oil became a tool for elites to enrich themselves. But in Norway, the government was expected not only to manage resources, but to protect the interests of the entire population. Norway understood one important truth: oil wealth would not last forever. They had already seen countries rise rapidly through natural resources, only to collapse from dependence on them. So from the very beginning, Norway chose to control its oil industry carefully. Just as they had once fought to control hydropower after independence, they applied the same philosophy to oil and gas. The government made its position clear. Natural resources belonged to the Norwegian people, not foreign corporations. International companies were still allowed to explore and drill because Norway lacked the technology and expertise at the time. But most of the profits had to benefit the country itself. That seemingly simple decision later became the foundation of one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in human history. At the same time, the state-owned oil company Statoil, now Equinor, was given a critical mission, not only to cooperate with foreign companies, but to learn from them and eventually surpass them. Norway understood that simply extracting oil was not enough. To become truly wealthy, the country needed to build an entire oil industry ecosystem, from drilling and transportation to refining and advanced engineering. That required massive investments in infrastructure, education, and workforce training, and this was the biggest difference of all. While many nations used oil money to cut taxes, expand subsidies, or push populist policies, Norway chose a more difficult but sustainable path. They understood that oil could make an economy dangerously dependent. If the petroleum sector became too dominant, it would crush other industries. So Norway deliberately limited oil production to around 90 million tons per year. It sounded unbelievable. A country rich in oil, voluntarily restricting its own extraction. Because for Norway, oil was not meant to replace the economy. It was meant to strengthen the entire economy together. Still, the road was far from smooth. The National Wealth Fund, although Norway wanted oil revenues to benefit the people, in the early years, the government still struggled to manage the enormous flow of money. The oil boom and rising global prices pushed revenues far beyond what the system could easily control. Then in the early 1980s, global oil prices collapsed. A worldwide recession spread rapidly, and Norway, despite its oil wealth, was hit hard. Economic growth nearly stalled for years. It was the same trap many oil nations had fallen into before. When an economy depends too heavily on one resource, it becomes extremely vulnerable to price swings. Norway quickly realized something important. Saving money alone was not enough. They needed a much longer-term strategy, and the solution was investment diversification. In 1990, Norway created the government pension fund, a decision later considered one of the smartest financial moves in modern history. Many countries had attempted similar sovereign wealth funds. Most failed, because those funds often became political piggy banks, used for short-term interests and power. Norway chose a completely different path, more transparent, more disciplined, and far less influenced by politics. The government introduced strict rules for the National Wealth Fund. Only the expected returns could be spent, while the original capital remained untouched. It sounded simple, but that single rule prevented politicians from burning through money for short-term popularity, while leaving future generations to suffer the consequences. The fund also followed unusual investment principles. It avoided unethical companies, it did not heavily focus on oil industries, and most importantly, it barely invested inside Norway itself. At first, that seemed strange. Why wouldn't Norway invest in its own country? The answer was risk diversification. If Norway's economy weakened, domestic companies would suffer too. But because the fund invested mostly abroad, national wealth remained protected. It became a giant financial safety net, helping the country survive future economic shocks. And the results were astonishing. Thanks to long-term discipline and strategic investing, Norway's sovereign wealth fund eventually became the largest in the world. The fund now owns shares in more than 9,200 companies globally, representing roughly 1.5% of the entire world stock market. By the end of 2024, the fund's total value reached around $1,720 billion. That means, on average, every Norwegian citizen effectively owns more than $300,000, an almost unbelievable number. While many European nations were forced to cut social spending during financial crises, Norway continued investing heavily in healthcare, education, and public welfare. Taxes in Norway remain among the highest in the world, but in return, citizens receive near-free high-quality healthcare, strong education systems, and low-income inequality. In many ways, Norway did not become rich simply because it had oil. Many countries have oil. What made Norway different was how it used that wealth. Norway did not treat oil as money to waste. It treated it as a tool to prepare for the future. Even today, despite oil and gas still playing a major role in the economy, Norway continues maintaining strong industries in technology, manufacturing, and services. And perhaps the most remarkable part is this: even if oil eventually disappears, Norway still has the foundations to remain one of the wealthiest countries on Earth. Is Norway truly a perfect model for every nation? The answer is no. Norway had unique advantages: massive offshore oil reserve, a small population, and a stable political system long before the oil boom began. And even Norway's model has weaknesses. Its large public sector can reduce competition and slow private business growth. Living costs are among the highest in the world, and heavy taxes make rapid expansion harder for companies. In other words, Norway is not a perfect paradise. It is simply the system that works best for Norway itself. And that may be the biggest lesson of all. Before becoming rich from natural resources, a country first needs strong institutions, transparent democracy, and long-term stability, because oil wealth always brings dangerous temptations. Without careful control, oil can fuel corruption, political conflict, and elite power struggles. Leaders become obsessed with short-term gains, while ignoring the future of the nation. And beyond that, to truly benefit from oil wealth, a country also needs strong industries, quality education, and leaders capable of long-term thinking. Without those things, oil is not always a blessing. Sometimes it becomes a curse. Venezuela is perhaps the clearest example. There was a time when it was one of the richest countries in the world because of oil. Venezuelans once lived more comfortably than much of South America. But today, the country is trapped in economic collapse, hyperinflation, and long-term poverty, the same resource, but two completely different outcomes. Norway became proof that a nation can manage natural resources in an efficient and sustainable way. Of course, luck played a major role, but luck alone was never enough. In many cases, luck itself can become a disaster, because when money arrives too quickly, people tend to make emotional and short-term decisions. While many countries used oil wealth to build flashy mega-projects, expand subsidies, or fuel corruption, Norway invested in things that produce no immediate excitement: education, infrastructure, technology, social welfare, and most importantly, the future. Today, those seemingly boring investments became the foundation of one of the most prosperous nations on Earth. In the end, economics is really the study of scarcity. Resources are scarce, money is scarce, opportunities are scarce, and sometimes even luck is rare. Countries that understand this and prepare for the future instead of only chasing the present tend to become more stable and sustainable than the rest of the world. And perhaps that is the real secret behind Norway's wealth.